all of us who think that Charlie Kirk was an authoritarian guy and heavily criticize him, though I condemned the shooting instantly, and I think that it's horrible. And I thought it was.
We called him a fascist, right? As soon as the shooting occurred,
because it was my belief before then.
You could say we condemn this killing, right? You could say that we condemn this assassination, and I think probably many of the Democrats, public officials probably do. But the problem is when you parrot the same lies that literally the killer was going after Charlie for, like, it seems to belie the fact that you want to tone down the rhetoric or something like that. For example, the New York Times within 24 hours of Charlie Kirk's assassination wrote a piece on him, right? They were forced to issue a retraction the next day after that. The retraction said something to the effect of this. We reported yesterday in our story that Charlie Kirk said some anti-Semitic quotes during his podcast. It is true that he said those quotes, but he was quoting someone else and arguing against them. So the paper of record that most Democrats would say is the most important newspaper in the country, within 24 hours was writing a story falsely smearing Charlie Kirk as a fascist, citing evidence where he was actually arguing against fascists. That's the sort of rhetoric and the sort of thing people are like, yeah, we're not happy that he was killed, but honestly, he kind of had it coming. But that's the rhetoric that they're using.
First of all, the New York Times makes fucking disastrous decisions like this, or they have shit slip through all the time. Libs fucking are so critical, even though I agree, your assessment of New York Times as the paper of record, as the Libs Bible sometimes isn't wrong. I'm not disputing that at all. All I'm telling you is that this kind of shit happens to the New York Times occasionally, and more than occasionally, and especially leftists criticize them for some of their coverage on like Israel, Palestine, that kind of shit, where they're like, bomb dropped, instead of like, you know, the active verbs, it's passive language, et cetera, et cetera. But it's to the New York Times' credit that they got something totally wrong as you're representing it, and then apologize and retracted for it. When the fuck do you see that kind of shit happening with these conservative influencer ghouls who immediately, it was so crazy. And I'm glad you didn't do this. And again, I'd say it's to your credit, but they went from suggesting that it's the Democrats' fault because, this guy was clearly radicalized by fucking Mark Kelly and Melissa Slotkin. And then when it turned out the guy was an Afghan, it's immediately Biden's fault. And without skipping a beat.
You mean the National Guard shooting?
The National Guard shooting, right?
Yeah, that's okay.
So, and what I'm trying to say is, like, where are the retractions for that? Where are the retractions for Dan Bongino and everyone trying to peddle these narratives where for years, like, Democrats are maligned as planning the pipe bombing? And,
we can get to the pipe bomb. What I'll say about this, though, is it's different to have individual. I've already criticized Bongino and stuff with the Epstein files and the lack of retraction, right? But it's different to have individuals versus like a newspaper of this equivalent. And show me any time that these prominent newspapers that do things like this have made that mistake in the other direction. Show me a left-winger being assassinated, brutally attacked or something, and these papers within 24 hours basically saying, wow, they're really bad people, though they sort of had it coming, and then saying, our bad, we got it exactly wrong. It doesn't happen. You're not going to be able to find it.
But I don't know if you'll laugh or you'll scream at me, but I think that they did this with Hunter Biden and Ken Vogel's reporting. I think Ken Vogel just, and oftentimes Maggie Haberman too, they just like take what Trump or Giuliani say and just publish it with like out any scruples and scrutiny, or at least not the degree that which I think. Now, it's not a murder exactly, and as I sit here, I can't give you a like comparison to what you're asking for, but I think that there are plenty of times where Democrats have taken issue with how
no. Those at the
same time, wait, one last thing I'll let you respond is Ezra Klein, who is the liberal darling, comes out and says Charlie Kirk, he did democracy the right way. And all of us who think that Charlie Kirk was an authoritarian guy and heavily criticize him, though I condemned the shooting instantly, and I think that it's horrible. And I thought it was.
We called him a fascist, right? As soon as the shooting occurred,
because it was my belief before then. Wouldn't it be like inconsistent and crazy of me to change my mind on that?
No, of course. Yeah. But to parrot the language immediately following his death, that he was a fascist language that was equal to what the shooter was saying.
No, but I'm not parodying the killer. I'm parodying my own opinion.
You're welcome to use that opinion. What I'm saying is, when we see that's done by an individual like you, it's one thing. I think it's grotesque and you're wrong about him being a fascist. But when we see this parroted by Democratic politicians and papers of records that Democrats trust, that's a different matter altogether. And the devil is in the details. I disagree with you.
I'd be a weasel.
I disagree with you about the characterization of Ken Vogel and the reporting on Hunter Biden anyways. But even aside from that, it's massively different than when someone is killed. Reverence is usually paid to a political figure that is killed.
I gave him 24 hours. I gave him 24 hours.
Not you. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the New York Times.
Oh.
So normally they would pay reverence to a political figure that was killed, and instead they
Ezra
basically
Klein did. Ezra Klein, this darling, was like
the New York Times. What I'm saying is the paper of record, instead of paying reverence, actually decided to smear Charlie Kirk and then have to retract 24 hours because their smear was false.
What I'm saying is, it's to their credit that they corrected it.
It's not to the credit. I mean, imagine. I just want to be clear. I just want to be clear. Are you telling me for a chance if like a prominent Democrat was assassinated, right? That you think the New York Times would come out and be like, well, this person did say, a bunch of heinous things. You think that would say that in like the immediate aftermath of that assassination and then get something 100% wrong, the wrong direction of it? You think that would happen? They wouldn't I don't think they would say anything that negative anyways, and they would certainly fact check the shit out of it. Yes.
For political figures who have been assassinated in this country, it's not first of all, political assassination, regrettably, it's unfortunate, is part of almost the DNA of American political life, and it's unfortunate. And the response to the death, either untimely, unlawful, or natural, of politicians isn't uniformly praising or having reverence. Some people, like myself, kind of view it a little bit cowardly to have this like. Now,
can you show me the example of a left-winger that was like brutally attacked, murdered, something like that, where the New York Times or a prominent left-leaning papers like that came out and were basically highly critical of them?
As I sit here, I don't know that I can provide you one off the top of my head. Give me some time. I'm not sure if you can find a light case for it. But what I'll say is, what do you think more likely happened? That this sinister New York Times reporter was like trying to fuck with Kirk, or he heard Kirk say that in like an out of context clip and reported on it and got that shit wrong? Which of those two things do you think is more likely?
I don't think that either of those are the most likely scenarios, so I reject both. Okay, I think that they disliked Charlie Kirk, right, and went to find things that they thought were negative that he said. Then they stumbled upon that quote and just heard it and weren't critical of it, so they reported it, only to be informed later and probably threatened with a lawsuit that, no, you dumbasses, he did say that, but he was angry about it, and he was arguing against the quote that he was reading. That's what I think happened. They intentionally went searching for inflammatory things he said to justify their. I don't think so.
Well, I think my intuition of that probably changes. Like if they are specific, because what you're saying doesn't sound implausible to me that someone could do that someone could be searching for bad things of Kirk. And I guess my intuition about whether that was like a good thing or bad thing to do might depend on like whether it was an op-ed or whether it was the reporting part of it. But here's the thing, Rob, like to me, okay, assume that was the motivation. Liberal newspaper is liberal. More at 11. Like what is the whole fucking what is your point about
it's this? Not the point is that basically the implication that we heard from prominent Democrats is they may have said the right thing. First off, they saw the mass amounts of Democrats that were celebrating this, so in the same time that was occurring, they basically were making the argument, well, yeah, but he was a really horrible person, so we understand.
Well, I think that part of Charlie Kirk's image has always been as a firebrand and as someone who is okay, so part of reporting what Charlie Kirk meant to America and how Republicans saw him and how Democrats saw him surely involves trying to assess why people are either upset with him or why people support him. In fact, in order to even explain, right, like why there could be people, and there were, in fact, and I condemn it, celebrating the death of Charlie Kirk, you would like even just to have context. A good reporter would need to explain why people were upset at him. So I just the context in which that comes up, I think, really matters to me, and whether or not we have evidence that it was done maliciously. We can keep going down this line, but I'm curious, like, all right.
I disagree. By the way, I'll just say this real quick. Like, according to a recent poll, I have to see where it came from, but according to this recent poll, a plurality of Democrats say that the person most responsible for the assassination of Charlie Kirk was Charlie Kirk and his own beliefs. They had that as higher than the beliefs and thoughts of the shooter.
The problem I have with a lot of these polls, Rob, is there's a couple senses in which people can use the term responsible, right? Like if we mean is culpable, and that I think is not an unfair interpretation, Rob, what you're saying as culpable, because people will say like, you caused this, you did this, sometimes to reference like you are culpable for what you did. In other words, you did a moral ought not, right? But there are other people who say like who mean it in a different sense. Like he's responsible if he, as like a but for thing. If he weren't saying these things, he wouldn't have been killed. Now, both things, I agree with it in one sense and not in another. I disagree, right, that he was culpable for his own death. I think that's preposterous, absurd, and I think that the person who's responsible, and this will get into what you think ought be done, using the death of Charlie Kirk, which you've been complaining about, the person who was responsible for his death is, in fact, the shooter, Tyler Robinson. And maybe there's some negligence somewhere else, or if you could prove one of these theories, Candace Owens, et cetera, that like, I don't know, Egypt or Israel or the combination of France and all these people did it, then you can see culpability there, or whoever was helping them if there's actually evidence of that. If you were to ask me, but for Charlie Kirk's views, would he have been killed? I think that like that's our whole argument, that it's a political assassination, that the causal relationship.
But there's two problems with that.
Yeah.
There's two problems with that. One, you could say, you could take that ad reducto anywhere and say, but for the birth of Charlie Kirk, would he have been assassinated? So it's like, yeah, I guess you could always blame anyone who's killed because they wouldn't have been killed if they don't exist. That seems to be a bad standard.
No,
and the problem is, even if I accept what you're saying here, the problem is it doesn't say, do you think Charlie Kirk is partly responsible for his own death, right? That's not the question. It is who is most responsible. And one of the options given is quite literally the mental health and views of the perpetrator. And so people saw these two options and said, the views of the killer or Charlie Kirk himself. Even under your loose interpretation of responsible, they still said Charlie Kirk was most responsible.
So Rob, I want to be clear. It is quite possible that this poll elides whatever issue I'm talking about or whatever. But like, I will just often see that like the polling done on like violence, the way they phrase it can sometimes be ambiguous. And I'm not saying that I would interpret responsibility that way. I'm just saying that some people might. But some people might interpret responsible. Yeah, if you hadn't done this, I'll give you another example, right? Like some people have said things like "fuck around and find out." If you go to a bad part of town, if you move to the city,
your boy Destiny.
Exactly, right? So people who have said this have, what they mean by like fuck around, find out, you do this and whatever happens to you, there's a sense of responsibility that even I think intuitively appeals to Republicans at times. I'll give you again the context of moving back into the cities. I've heard Republicans say, I don't want to hear about your complaints regarding violence. If you get mugged or whatever, don't come crying to me. You chose to live in this city after you knew Democrat policies, whatever. And that could be the sense in which some people answer that. But to put all
that's
that
a different level, because it would be the equivalent of saying, well, if you it's the equivalent of, well, you wore a short dress and you work down the street. Yeah, there are people. Okay, but you wouldn't say that no one in their right mind would say that she's most responsible, even more responsible than the sexual assault.
No, I agree. I think it would depend. Right. All I'm giving you is a general complaint that I would need to see how it's asked. Maybe this polling is done in a good way. I'm not sure. I'm not a fucking statistician, but I just will sometimes see, even also by the another example of this is the recent strikes on Venezuela, drug boats, where you see how the polling is done, and it's like, do you think that we should destroy drug boats in the middle of the ocean? Well, like, and their answer is like, yes, we should do that. But oftentimes that's like not the important moral issue. The important moral issue is, should we in fact like kill people in these strikes when they're being targeted? So
which group or persons would you say is most responsible for each event? The fatal shooting of conservative activist Charlie Kirk in Utah on September 10th, 2025. Corporate media, there's a small percentage that say that. This is limited to Democrats with the certain degrees, but it's the same without the degrees if you look at it with the Democrats. Political opponents, 15%, their own political views and rhetoric, 40% when it comes to Charlie Kirk, and then the mental health and views of each perpetrator, 32%. Unsure, no opinion, 10%.
This is exactly the problem, Rob. Like this kind of question is kind of, it seems to imply some kind of causality term of it, not a culpability term of it. Like what is most responsible? No. Okay, I mean, maybe
I totally. I could go to the restroom. I'll be right back.
Okay, go for it.